Welcome to Swakan, another session with Syed Kamall from Institute for Economic Affairs. And thank you so much, Syed Kamall, for actually joining us, accepting our invitation. And I would like to go through his formal bio, then I will actually add on my personal points on his profile. So Syed Kamall is actually Academic Research Director at Institute for Economic Affairs. IEA is actually one of the oldest and one of the most influential free market classical liberal think tank in the world. And he actually works as Academic and Research Director. And also he's a Professor of International Relations and Politics at St. Mary's University. And he actually previously worked in IT in terms of strategy, public affairs, diversity consultant. And most important thing, he was actually served as a member of European Parliament from London from 2005 to 2019, where he actually headed Conservative Party member of Parliament. And he was also leader of the European Conservatives and Reformists in the European Parliament. And apart from his formal one, I was actually started getting involving in European politics when I actually moved 4 years back, and I was actually connected with liberals and Democrats, where I had a previous connection when I was in India, and I was looking for the people who's actually actively promoting classical liberal ideas and free markets, both at the same time. And apart from liberal Democrats, I see there is a party, and also there is a very strong people, leaders who's actually promoting ideas of classical liberalism at core. I mean, very, very actively, effectively. And Syed Kamall was the one who was actually leading that party. And he was at forefront to trying to hold the European Union to become an authoritarian state. And I got a chance to meet with Professor in US last year, where I got a chance to have a few words with him. He's very humble, down to earth, and is more than his credentials, his personality is actually very, very inspiring. And thank you so much, Kamall. I would like to take the floor and tell your experiences about how classical liberals can actually promote our ideas through politics.
Okay, well, Venkatesh, well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's good to see you again. I really appreciate being invited to this forum to speak with a number of Indian classical liberals. I think it's important that, especially in this day of digital communications, that we work together across the world and learn from each other, see what works in our countries, what doesn't work, and also learn the context. It's very easy for me as a Brit, someone to say, this is how we promote classical liberalism in Britain or in Europe. But with that, you also have to understand the context of the country, the cultural differences of the country, and also the similarities. You don't also have to assume that things are the same or different, and we just have to understand the context. So let me. You asked me to speak about classical liberalism and politician and politics. Let me start off with something that you might find quite unusual, which is you don't have to be a politician if you want to promote classical liberalism in politics. Now, that might seem unusual because I was a politician. I'm now a think tank and a university professor. But I'll take you back to a story. After World War II, when Anthony Fisher, who founded the IEA in 1955, which, as Venkatesh says, is the oldest classical liberal free market think tank, he was worried about the government that had just been elected after the war, who were talking about nationalization and talking about central economic planning. And he read the Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom. And so he approached Friedrich Hayek and he said, look, you've influenced me. I really want to change things. And I'm worried about where the politics is going. So I'm going to go into politics. And Hayek convinced him not to go into politics. Hayek actually convinced him that the best thing he could do is use his money to set up a think tank and to change the intellectual climate. It's the best medium for affecting political change. So what I would say in the first place is you don't have to be a politician. You can go around the world of politics. You can be an advisor. You can write policy papers. You might just be a very good entrepreneur and you can make lots of money. And then you can use your money to fund good classical liberal think tanks or scholarships for classical liberal students or fund university departments. You might be a journalist, you might be a good writer, and you get a following, and you can influence public opinion by writing about the world from a classical liberal perspective. You might be a teacher or a professor. You know, one of the things I found about being out of academia for 20 years and going back is how biased the academia is. And in some areas that I wanted to see more balance. You know, I don't expect academia to suddenly go from being Marxist to a classical liberal overnight. But I think students deserve a balance and to be exposed to a range of ideas. And therefore, one of the things I've tried to do is get some more classical liberal ideas onto the curriculum, into the university libraries, and bring about that academic balance. You might be a religious person. You might want to be a priest, a pujari, an imam, a rabbi, etc. And maybe you can talk about, be a religious leader, but also take a classical liberal perspective in terms of toleration, in terms of live and let live, in terms of the difference between the public sphere of morality and the personal sphere of morality. You might be a good finance person. So don't necessarily think that you have to be a politician. But if you are a politician, I will come to that later. Now, if you get involved in politics, then quite often you are asked, particularly in the European Parliament, to specialize in particular areas. And the obvious area for me to specialize in my time in the European Parliament, first of all, was stuff that I knew about. So I knew about technology, I knew about trade. I'd been previously an international business, international trade academic. And I started working on it, being a member of the International Trade Committee, trying to fight the battle for free trade. A very narrow area, but a very important area. After the financial crisis, I was concerned about the amount of financial legislation coming our way. I was an MEP for London. London would be disproportionately hit. So I went onto the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee and quickly learned a lot about finance and to be able to look at the legislation from that perspective. Now, what I'd say if you go into politics itself, and maybe even outside politics, is build coalitions. First of all, just remember that there is no one classical liberal idea. Classical liberalism is a spectrum of views, and classical liberals themselves will disagree. I'm sure when you have debates at SWACON and your other fora you go to, whether it's Students for Liberty or other fora, you will have disagreements. There is no one classical liberal view. It's a spectrum of views. As Dr. Eamon Butler wrote in an IEA primer on classical liberalism, he said, classical liberals disagree about the exact role of the state, but generally wish to limit the use of the force, whether by individuals or governments. They call for states that are small and kept in bounds by known rules. So you will disagree about the size of the state. You will disagree about what services the state should provide for it, for example. But be inclusive, don't be exclusive. Don't get into the old battle that you saw between the Austrians and the Chicago School, accusing each other, of not being liberal enough or whatever. Be more inclusive. Be more inclusive is what I would say. And I've seen examples of people saying, for example, I saw someone who wrote the other day about, I'm a member of a network called the Islam and Liberty Network, for example. But I also saw a liberal write, Islam is not compatible with liberalism. Well, fine if you believe that, but does that really help us to promote liberal ideas in the Muslim world or with Muslims? No, it doesn't. So why be exclusive and say you're not liberal and I am liberal? Why don't we build those coalitions within the classical liberal movement? And then, of course, in real politics, you have to build those coalitions across the spectrum. So, for example, on issues such as civil liberties, I would find some colleagues on the left that I could build coalitions with. For example, on financial services and transparency, I could find some colleagues who agreed on transparency and were also against crony capitalism, which is what classical liberals should also be against. So therefore, you can find individual issues where you can build coalitions across spectrum. But also bear in mind, classical liberals will disagree. In my own country, when we had the Brexit referendum in 2016, classical liberals were on both sides of the argument. When we debate how to recover from COVID and the lockdown, there are different views. Some are saying tax cuts, some are saying reluctantly increase taxes. Others are saying no. We shouldn't have any restrictions at the moment and let people take the risk. And for example, there are other disagreements on things like immigration policy. The other thing you've got to remember when you actually get elected is you've got lots of other considerations. You have to be accountable to the people who vote for you, and they themselves may not appreciate classical liberal ideas. And also, are you really at the forefront of a movement as one member of Parliament, amongst many, in rolling back the state or furthering freedom? How can you do that? Think about how you could do that in a realistic way. I found in my time in the European Parliament that a lot of it was getting involved in the details of legislation, but not necessarily rolling forward freedom, but limiting the damage that could come from bad legislation. Not really, it doesn't sound as exciting as holding that torch of liberty and marching forth into the battle of ideas, but just in some ways it was as important to make sure that that legislation that came our way wasn't too damaging and that we created enough freedom in the economic space for competition and free market ideas that we believe in. But as I said at the beginning, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be an elected politician. You can be a political advisor. You can help change the nature of the, you can help change the thought process. Sometimes it will take a long time. In the 1950s in the UK, the IEA put out some papers about telecommunications and privatization. Now you have to remember, in those days, most telephony systems were part of a PTT, Post, Telegraph and Telephony. And everyone thought that telephony should only be offered by a state monopoly PTT. So when the IEA were putting out papers suggesting that not only should you separate post and telecoms, not only should you separate operation and regulation, but you should actually privatize the telecoms company and then actually have more than one telecoms company competing against each other, people thought they were mad. But you fast forward 30 years and suddenly you started seeing a debate on privatization, deregulation, liberalization. And it took another 10 years for a duopoly in the UK. So maybe 50 years after that, you actually got more of a competitive market. What that means is that your ideas will not always win immediately. And you may have to be patient, but you have to put the ideas on the agenda for people to start thinking about them as well. And lastly, I would say, the battle for ideas is never over. When I was a PhD student, I remember Francis Fukuyama writing a book, The End of History and the Last Man, where he said liberal democracy had triumphed and we can all go home or go to bed and that's the way it is. Well, he didn't actually say we could all go home or go to bed, but what was interesting about that was, fast forward to my own country, the UK, in 2017, where we very nearly elected a hard left government. Clearly, liberal democracy had not won. Clearly, the battle for ideas is never over, and you have to keep engaging it. So that's my overall introductory remarks. What I would say to you is, think about what you're good at. What do you actually like doing? And what do you enjoy doing? If you want to go and be a business person and make lots of money and then use that money for good classical liberal causes, great. If you want to be a journalist or an author and then influence public opinion, great. If you want to be a teacher or a priest or a leader, or you want to be a finance guy or lady, great. You can all make a contribution towards the battle for liberty. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. So I would like to ask first question, which is actually very interesting one. I actually go through your website a few months back. I say that one of your beliefs is actually mentioned ambition. So what is it ambition means to classical liberals? Why ambition is very important for classical liberals?
Well, I mean, I think ambition is important more than just to classical liberals. I think there is something that I find, that I think is really important, and is that for as much as possible for people to realize their potential. There are so many people that you will have seen out there, particularly when you meet older people, and you realize how smart they are or what good skills, and they never realize their potential. And you think it's really sad that those people didn't know. They've lived through life and they didn't realize their potential. Now, maybe, to be honest, they are happy. And we shouldn't judge things by material wealth, for example. They might be happier in another way. But I think what's really important is, is striving for self-improvement, wanting to improve yourself, wanting to make a better person of yourself, but also wanting to contribute, once you've made a success of yourself, contribute to your wider society. Some people say giving back, others say, well, not necessarily giving back, but sharing your good fortune with others. And I suppose what I mean by that is, if you think about markets, if you think about the way that most economics teach markets, they teach it very badly. They teach this idea of a perfect market, perfect information. Everyone knows, has all this information, and you reach the equilibrium position. And then they say, oh, but there's market failure. This is why we need state intervention. But actually, if you look about how markets really work, it's not in a top-down perfect way. There's no such thing as a perfect market. What you see is that you see hundreds, thousands, millions of willing buyers and sellers, entrepreneurs, people who have created a service or a product, and there are others who want to buy it. Willing buyers and sellers. And when you aggregate up all those millions of buyers and sellers up together, that's what Hayek would call a spontaneous order of the market. It hasn't been created from top down. It's emerged spontaneously. And what drives that are entrepreneurs, the human spirit, people wanting to improve their own lives, people want to necessarily improve other lives. Maybe they necessarily don't set out to improve other lives, but as Adam Smith or Ferguson talked about, they talked about the fact that, enlightened self-interest, by acting in their own interest and pursuing their own goals, they also make society a better place. So when you think about that, the entrepreneurs who create new goods and services or create new innovations, these are people who want to improve something, improve themselves, but also improve the life around us. And I think that's a great ambition. You don't only have to be ambitious for yourself. You can be ambitious for your family, your wider community, and your country as well.
Interestingly, you also mentioned that community solutions most of the time, and also your current response. Why do you think community solution, locally grown community solutions, actually works way better than the government handouts?
I think when I talk about community solutions, is I look at the history of the UK welfare state. And in the United Kingdom, we used to have lots and lots of friendly societies. Trade unions used to play their role to help people who had fallen on hard times or couldn't help themselves anymore. And what was interesting about that was after the Second World War, I talked about that with Anthony Fisher, the British government decided to introduce a welfare state. And that's understandable because not everybody was being helped. There were people who were falling through the gaps. And the welfare state was supposed to be a safety net. But what it ended up doing over time, it grew and it started squeezing out non-state solutions. So the number of friendly societies fell, for example. Interestingly enough, Beveridge, who designed the welfare state, actually wanted the welfare state to work with existing friendly societies, but they got squeezed out because they weren't offering a uniform service. And over time, you saw the state grow. And then what that happens is the state then takes more money from individuals in terms of taxation. And the state starts to think that officials start to think they know better how to spend the money that you earn. Now, of course, I think we all want to see less poverty and less hardship. And unless you're an anarcho-capitalist, you probably think there should be some role for government. It could be a night watchman role. It could be about defense, security, health and safety. Some of you may feel it should be a little bit more. My own view is, I do realize that, there has to be some sort of welfare state, some sort of safety net. Some classical liberals will disagree with me on that. But I think the first resort should be self-help. So if people have a problem, can they get together and solve the problem in their local community because they are closer to the problem? And one of the things that I'm trying to work with at the IEA is trying to, rather than just be a think tank, is to be a do tank. And when people see a problem locally and they want to solve it, how do we help them to incubate their local solution far better? They might do it just with their friends and family. It might be a local civil society organization. It might be a local temple or a mosque or a church or a gurdwara who do this. And we see a lot of this. If you are religious, you will see a lot of this in whichever religion you are. Not necessarily going to the state, but helping those less fortunate than ourselves or tackling a social problem. And sometimes what the state does is, it's well-intentioned, but it inadvertently squeezes out a lot of that self-help and that trying to solve the problem for ourselves. So it becomes a first resort and no longer a last resort.
Thank you so much. So we can also add one point for that. One is we have seen that civil society has been very, very actively actually supported people and their communities together during the COVID-19, where government repeatedly failed to address these people. And I will go back to the classical liberalism and politics and the theme. So in general, classical liberal parties doesn't actually get a very great electoral results. We can see in a libertarian party in US are there are, I mean, like liberal Democrats, in my view, certainly close to classical liberal party, but I mean, like, but I don't see a single classical liberal party that actually had a great success in terms of electoral results. Why do you think?
Because I think classical liberalism actually spans the spectrum. So you will find classical liberals in all parties. So, for example, in the UK, until recently, we probably still, in the UK, as someone who was a classically liberal-minded, I had two choices. I had the Conservatives, where they were classical liberals, but also you end up with a lot of social conservatives, or you have the Liberal Democrats. But really, our current Liberal Democrats in the UK, we have to remember that the old Liberal Party merged with the Social Democrats. So in the UK, our Liberal Democrat Party, there's a constant struggle between the Social Democrats and the old Liberals. And occasionally, there are coalitions to be formed. For example, the leaders of the party in 2015, there were a lot of Orange Book liberals, classical liberals, and that's why they found it relatively easy to work with the Conservatives. So in 2010, found it relatively easy to work with the Conservatives in coalition. When I was in the European Parliament, I found classical liberals in my group, the European Conservatives and Reformists, in the European People's Party, the Christian Democrat group, in the Liberal Democrats, and even surprisingly, one or two in the Greens and one or two in the Social Democrats as well. And so what happens is, in politics, no party, you will not agree with everything that your party stands for. And so one of the things I say to people going into politics is join the party you agree with most or you disagree with least. You are not going to agree with absolutely everything in that party. And sometimes you will agree with some of the policies or ideas from other parties. There is no one Syed Kamall party, that I'll agree with. And don't forget, not all classical liberals agree. As I said, during the Brexit referendum, there were classical liberals on both sides. When I was in the European Parliament, it was very interesting talking to some of the liberals in the liberal group there. And they would say to me, if I'm given a choice between Europe and liberalism, I'll always choose Europe. I said, well, hold on a minute. There's no contention there. Why don't you talk about liberalism within the European context? So it really is an individual thing. Yes, you can try and set up a classical liberal party, and that's not bad. And that's not bad where people have people feel neglected by the mainstream parties or the existing parties. But if they're not going to vote for you and it's too difficult, I would encourage classical liberals to join all the parties, or as many parties as they can, and then to build coalitions of classical liberals.
It's the same solution that some of the classical liberals in India actually come up a few years back. Instead of actually creating, because India doesn't have any real classical liberal party. So instead of creating a new one, and we can actually infiltrate ranks of the mainstream parties where we actually have agree with most. And my next question, you actually mentioned when we're talking about politics and also organization, coalitions are very, very important. Finding a common ground is very, very important. And what you did at ECR is actually a coalition. You actually bring a lot of very diverse groups together. And also, when I see liberal Democrats, it's also the kind of same thing. I directly connected with FDP in Germany, but Aldi Party connection actually comes through FDP. And when I see it, even in the Aldi Party, they actually running away from a core liberal principles. I mean, like they narrow downing their view focus on either social democrats or a more political liberal kind of one, and they actually cutting down their free market and more libertarian kind of association. At the same time, in the ECR group also, there are fractions that are actually more nationalistic oriented. So how we can actually, when we are actually building a coalition, how we can actually kept our core value at center of our political alliance, and how can we, not going away from our core message.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the very difficult questions about politics. And I ask myself this all the time. And even looking back now, I wonder sometimes, did I do the right thing there and then? You know, with hindsight, should I really have built that coalition? Should I have been tougher then? And it's very easy to say with hindsight. You know, I made mistakes, and I think, I'm human. We all make mistakes, and we all learn from our mistakes. And it's interesting, in the ECR group, we had to build a coalition. We were, the problem with European politics, and I'm sure you're aware, is that there are two extremes. There's one who believes in the sort of 1950s model of further political integration, creating a United States of Europe or a Federal Republic of Europe. And there's another coalition who just wants to blow the whole thing up. I mean, not literally, but they want the EU to fall apart. And the ECR group was saying, well, we don't agree with either of those options. We want to keep the European Union together, but we want it to be a looser arrangement and one of willing coalitions, as it were. Those countries that want to go further can go further without taking the other countries. Those who want to hold back can hold back. So a sort of multi-geometry Europe. Now, what's interesting about that was when we set up the ECR group, the problem was the Conservative Party in Britain was saying one thing in London and then sitting with the European People's Party in Brussels and Strasbourg, which was which probably one of the most federalist pro-political integration groups. So we were accused of hypocrisy. So David Cameron, who was then leader, decided to set up a new political group. And at the beginning, we had a real debate. In some ways, I lost out that debate because I was one of those people who said, let's build a coalition. Let's forget the issue of Europe, whether you're Eurosceptic or not. And let's build a coalition of classical liberal free market parties. So we'll take some from the EPP, the Christian Democrats, some from the ALDE, and those others. The other coalition, and the one that we ended up with ECR, was Eurosceptics. People who were skeptical about further political integration, but didn't want to destroy the EU. And that became the binding factor. That was the coalition. And within that coalition, we had a range of views from liberal conservatives such as myself, all the way through to people who are more socially conservative or more nationalistic. And that's the price you pay for building a coalition. But that's the way the system was, and you have to build that coalition. And whichever group you ended up in, you will end up with people that you disagree in as part of a coalition. But what it enabled me to do, to have that position and that platform as group leader or to represent in various debates, I could then build cross-party coalitions. So for example, on the International Trade Committee, I could build coalitions with the Christian Democrats and the Liberal group, for example. And sometimes even groups that you wouldn't imagine, for example, the Independence and Democracy group, for example. And so that's the pragmatism of politics. And that's why some classical liberals, some purists, are put off from everyday politics, because it's very difficult to hold that purity in absolutely every policy view. And there were times when I was leading the group, and there were people within my groups that I fight, not violently, but I really disagreed with. There were some protectionists in my group, for example, on free trade. There are others who were not as open. But I would have found that whichever political group or whichever political party I was in, I think the thing for you to remember is why you went into politics. And when I became the leader of the Conservatives before I became leader of the group, I actually sat down my MEPs and I said to them, I want you to think about why you went into politics. None of you went into politics to sign a written declaration or to submit an amendment. You went in for a higher reason. If we can work out what that is and remember what that is, we will be a happier group all round. And I think it's very easy, particularly if you have a perspective, classical liberal or otherwise, that when you're building a coalition and the pragmatism of politics, that you go for building the coalitions and you forget about the principles that drove you there. So that's why I'm saying it's not always ideal to be a politician. Now in my new life as an academic and at the think tank, I could be academically pure as a classical liberal. But even there, we have disagreements because classical liberals don't agree on everything. So some of my colleagues want to talk more about lifestyle issues, about smoking, drinking, drugs. I don't want to talk about that. I mean, I'd rather, I don't care too much about the nanny state. I'd rather it wasn't there, but I don't get as upset about that as I do, for example, about protectionism or civil liberties, for example, or tolerance and freedom. So even within the classical liberal movements, there will be disagreements about what's the most important battles to fight.
It is very true. Even in India, we have the same kind of in priority disagreements. Which one we should actually follow?
It's part of human nature, though. It's part of human nature.
True. And get back to your response. I see that you did a great job in European Parliament. I have been actually following European politics the last 4 years closely, and you've been asking questions that no one else is actually asking. And even though I am in bit of pro-European Union, but I also have a certain level of disagreements where you actually ask these kind of questions that I actually agree with. And so how much European Union is actually a very liberal institution? Because I see European Union did a very great job in certain aspects. And how do you see it? Do you see it as a liberal institution, how much it did, how much good it did, and also how much potential it had to do the bad? I mean, you actually stopped it for a while, and I would like to hear from you. I mean, like, how do you see it?
In terms of the word liberal, of course, we understand that there are different uses of the word liberal. There's a modern liberal perspective as well. And also from an international relations perspective, which is a subject I teach in global governance, you have different schools of liberalism on international relations. And so liberal institutionalists would see the EU as a model. It's got broadly liberal values, openness, tolerance, blah blah blah, and these are institutionalized. Liberal democracy, ideas such as that. Now, the interesting thing is, if you are a classical liberal, it depends which country you come from, where you see the EU as a good thing. For most countries, the EU has been a great thing, a great organization in terms of forcing their governments to liberalize. And I remember one of my first papers I wrote when I became an MEP was the dilemma of being a classical liberal in the European Parliament. Because I found there was a debate. There were people who said, what you should do is wait for countries to realize that their more protectionist policies are wrong, or their socialist policies are wrong, and they'll see the other countries, the ones that liberalize, do well, and eventually they will liberalize. It might take longer, but let them realize that's the way to do it. And others said, no, you have to use whatever tools you have at your disposal. So I saw the EU, and I was quite provocative, I saw the EU as coercively liberalizing markets over the heads of reluctant governments. But if you're in one of those countries, say for example, you're French, and you're a French liberal, the French government on its own would probably never have liberalized telecoms market, probably would never have more competition there. But by having the EU liberalize, clearly the EU is seen to be a good liberal institution. But if you're from the UK, which was relatively free traded and relatively liberal, you get frustrated by the fact that you can't sign, well, we couldn't sign our own trade agreements. We had to wait for the other 27 countries, some of them which were very protectionist, in order to sign trade agreements. So one, I'd say it depends which country you're from and how liberal it is compared to the general political consensus in your country. So if you're for example, if you're a classical liberal from Poland, Poland is a relatively socially conservative country, you will see the EU in a positive light. In the UK, clearly, we had disagreements. That's why we had the referendum, and so you will see it in different ways. What was interesting was during the British referendum, we had not only free market liberals who voted a leave because they saw the EU as a socialist conspiracy, but you also had hard left people who saw the EU as a liberal conspiracy. So they both can't be right. So I think it really depends on your relative position and whether you think it promotes that agenda that you believe in. So there are some very good liberal perspectives. I thought DG Trade was very free trade. I thought on the whole, but on the other hand, DG Environment and DG Employment were very protectionist and very anti-liberal. So even within the EU, between the different directorates in the Commission, there were battles in terms of ideology. But most of the people I met in DG Trade in the EU were free traders. But when you speak to people in the employment directorate or the environment directorate, they tended to be more protectionist. So I think it really, first of all, depends on your area and also which country you're from.
Okay, thank you so much. I actually someone who sees you has some very good positive aspects to actually bring together European countries and build a better relation in terms of trade, commerce. At the same time, there is a possible threat to become a more authoritarian and top-down approach institution. And my next question is actually, I recently seen something which UK Finance Minister, if I'm not wrong, Rishi Sunak actually announced 350 billion pounds of the bailout packages. And he actually told media that it's not a time for ideology. This is something India has a very big problem because Indian political parties is not actually very ideological based. Most of them mostly left oriented, even though conservative party actually believe in welfare state and also public spending, more regulations in the market till certain level. So why is there a very important ideological position each political party should have an ideological position, or I can say like worldview of the political party? How much is important?
Yeah, I mean, look, we all go into politics, or we hope that they would be, but we have to deal with the world the way it is, not the way we want it to be. And a lot of political parties aren't particularly ideological. I mean, they vary over time, and we saw the Labour Party become quite ideological under Jeremy Corbyn, trying to become a bit more pragmatic now. And most political parties have to balance ideology and pragmatism. And that's just the way it is, because even political parties themselves are coalitions. Not everyone will agree within a political party. I would find myself disagreeing fundamentally with some of my conservative colleagues. I know people from other parties tell me about disagreements with their colleagues from all parties. So it's a coalition of common thought. On the whole, the left will believe that there has to be a larger role for the state. Maybe they think that, I think it comes down to this, funny enough, in the UK. Who has first call on the money you earn? And I would say, when you earn your money for the work you do, I would say the left generally feel the state has the first call on it and then lets you keep the amount it thinks it should keep. Whereas the right generally says, no, it's your money, you work for it, and the state should have some call on it, but you should be allowed to keep as much of your money as possible and pay what the state needs to provide its services. Whereas the left would be very different and say, no, the state has the first right to your money. And I think that, that's very broad. Within both those coalitions, you have a huge range of disagreements about what the state should do, what it shouldn't do, and so I think we have to accept that a lot of politics is not ideological. I mean, when I think about some of the local community projects I work with in the UK, some of them tell me, yes, we are welfare without the state. We are local libertarians, or we are community conservatives, or we are cooperative socialists. But actually, most of them are not ideological. They're just trying to solve the problem in front of them. And so I think we've got to be very careful when you're ideological to try and see everything through, or try and say to everyone, you must see this through an ideological spectrum. You have to balance that with pragmatism. And that is one of the problems as well, or issues with politics. Because you might go in as a classical liberal, but then you've got to face pragmatism. And remember, there's no one classical liberal view. I recently wrote a blog about how classical liberals respond to the COVID crisis and the government extra government intervention. And I quote Rishi Sunak. And what's interesting about that is that there are a number of classical liberals. Very few classical liberals would have said, well, sorry, these companies should have seen all this coming. The government shouldn't do anything. A lot of classical liberals in times of emergency see a role for government, but in times of emergency, not when things are back to a normal.
Okay. Thank you so much for that wonderful answer. And I will take a question from the audience. So what, according to you, is the political future of our classical liberalism, given that we are seeing a rise in populism?
I think the thing about populism, and I met a number of populist parties in the European Parliament. One of the reasons that populist parties do well is because people feel that the mainstream parties have ignored them and taken them for granted. And the most successful mainstream parties are those who effectively said, we hear your concerns, we will try and address your concerns. Not necessarily, now, some of them actually play up and try and make it worse and say, oh, it's terrible, all this immigration, it's awful, and therefore we should, let's kick them all out and vote for us. But others say, look, we understand your concerns about immigration, so what we're going to do is try and limit the numbers coming, for example. Now, whether you or I disagree or agree with that, it's a way of showing as a political party that you are addressing the concerns. Or you change your immigration system so it's one, for example, a point system, so you positively show the contribution that immigrants are making rather than necessarily saying that anyone can come. So I think we have to accept that, where the electorate feel let down by a mainstream party, if the mainstream parties don't react, that does give opportunities, and that might be an opportunity for classical liberal parties, but it also means that those parties that are seen to be empathetic to those views of the people who feel left behind or disillusioned will succeed. So where does classical liberalism go? Yes, you could form a classical liberal party and hope that most people are empathetic to classical liberals. I would say, as I said earlier, join the party that you agree with most or disagree with least, and then fight for classical liberal ideas within that party.
Thank you so much. I closely observed in Italian elections, that's what happened with the Five-Star Movement and the Liga, where center-right, center-left actually avoided people concerned with immigration and wealth creation jobs, and people actually choose someone who is actually completely anti-establishment candidates. So the next question from the audience: do you think classical liberal politicians need to approach the issues from a traditional indigenous perspective?
I think you have to understand the context of the country or the environment you're working in. Let me give you an example. When I first became an MEP, there was a certain arrogance amongst British free marketeers that they think that actually the only British people are classical liberals, for example. And it's not until I was in the European Parliament and I met the rich diversity of classical liberals from other countries. And you remember, you think about things like Frederick Bastiat, for example, from France and others. And that, you understand how classical liberalism in the UK became seen as very much British conservative because the Liberal Democrats had effectively abandoned classical liberalism at that time and were trying to be more socialistic. But I saw classical liberalism very much in its context. For example, my FDP colleagues in Germany, for example, understanding that liberal tradition, which wasn't as Eurosceptic, for example, or the liberal tradition, the different liberal traditions in the Netherlands, for example, between D66 and the VVD, for example. So I think you have to you're absolutely right. You can't just say this is British classical liberalism and let's try and export it to India or export it to elsewhere. You in India have to build your own classical liberalism, understanding the cultural context of the country. But that doesn't mean it's completely different. But it just means you can still believe in the ideas of freedom and tolerance and free markets. Those are those are universal. But you also have to understand where people may well have concerns and where there may be cultural concerns about some of the ideas that we propose.
So one other thing I actually observed from your speeches, so you actually telling European Union has to find common solutions instead of not the common solution. The European countries has to found their own solutions within the European context rather than having a very umbrella network which might not work, especially context of when you say with President Emmanuel Macron about with something that works for France does not work for everyone. So in an era of globalization and European Union, how we can actually find a common ground? Do you think we actually use EU force to make it more, make it forcefully, make it happen in the statewide? Or else states, nation states should actually have come up with a common agreeable position where they can actually work together.
Actually, Hayek had a very good chapter on this in The Road to Serfdom about international organizations. And he was very much against the sort of one-size-fits-all approach of international organizations. There will be spontaneous emerging coalitions where you can work together. And there will be areas that you can agree on. So, for example, look at world trade, for example. Over time, more and more countries see the advantages of being relatively open to trade or relatively free trading. Some might want a transition period. Some might try and protect their infant industries at some stage, but then realize, okay, the producers might like that, but as a consumer, if you're told as a consumer in India that you have to only go to the state monopoly provider and you can't have the choice of foreign providers as well as the local producers, then you start thinking, well, hold on a minute, that doesn't really benefit me, this protectionism. It protects that producer or the rent seeker. So I really do think we've got to be careful about saying that this will work and this is where we build a common coalition. As much as we want it to work like that, particularly we want to push classical liberalism, we want everyone to be free traders and classical liberals, but let's not forget about the way that orders emerge and the spontaneous order and the emergence. Sometimes it takes a long time and we've got to be part of that process. How can we be part of that process to ensure that we arrive at a solution that we agree with? We won't win all the battles. We will not win all the battles. I don't think in my lifetime I will see a perfectly classically liberal world. I won't even see a perfectly classically liberal Britain. I won't see even a classically liberal London. But you still have to fight for those ideas.
Thank you so much. I will come back to one of the biggest problems that Europe actually faced last five years. I think it's still actually facing. Immigration has been a center point of European politics in most of the European countries. So how do you see what kind of immigration policy should European countries should have?
Yeah, I mean, that's really difficult because I used it. What you've got to understand is, a lot of classical liberals would say there should be a relatively open immigration policy. That doesn't mean completely open borders. It's interesting. I was just chairing a webinar with Dr. Chandran Kukuthas, who's now at Singapore Management University, and he was talking about immigration and freedom. And even the most open borders sort of people would say there has to be some control. You wouldn't want to let in, for example, criminals or terrorists. In some cultural contexts, you might say, we may not want, we're letting your first spouse, but we're not going to let in all four spouses, for example. There will be other, or if you've got a criminal conviction, or if you've been a member of a extremist movement, or if you can't support yourself. So there'll always be some criteria. No country has completely open borders. But even when you do have open borders, we had an experiment in the UK. In the late 90s, when we had a Labour government, the Labour government actually said at the time that they wanted to rub the right's nose in multiculturalism and effectively have open borders. And what we saw with the effectively open borders policy was a backlash. We saw a rise of we never had a fascist party. We haven't had a fascist party for a long time in the UK. We had, or one that got elected. We had the British National Party, who got elected to local councils. They got elected to the London Assembly. They actually had a couple of members of the European Parliament elected from the UK. And that was a backlash against an open door policy because people felt that they were being swamped and not in control. And interestingly, one of the academics at the time wrote, people aren't necessarily anti-immigration in the UK, but it was the rate of change that was too quick. So I think what we've got to look at is I think you've got to be relatively open to new talent and the best, but I think you've got to have transparent rules or transparent criteria for those you let in. And I'm hoping that now the UK has left the EU, we had an immigration policy where effectively anyone with an EU passport could come in. But people without an EU passport had to apply for visas and all sorts of barriers. Some people thought that was a racist immigration policy because most Europeans are, most European countries are white, most non-European countries are not white. Whether you agree with that or not, now we're going to hopefully move towards an immigration policy where it's based on skills and what contribution you can make to the UK. And that will be a dynamic policy where you keep changing the point system as you meet those vacancies, as well as having a humanitarian part to it, where you have those people who are fleeing hardship and problems. You have to let some of them in, but you can't let them all in. And we haven't really taken a proper holistic view in terms of the migrants from Syria and the Middle East and elsewhere. The EU on a whole has basically bribed Turkey to keep many of them, those people there, but they're not going to be able to do that for a long time. And also, let's be honest, some of that is a result of Western foreign policy. Those toppling Saddam and toppling Muammar Gaddafi, they weren't very pleasant people. They ran awful regimes. But had we properly thought through the implications of toppling them and supporting the local opposition movements and to stop this, we hadn't thought it through. We just thought by toppling them, we could impose democracy and it would be great overnight. And that once again shows the danger of trying to have a one size fits all, assuming that because it works in our country, it will work in that context. And it goes back to the earlier question about understanding the indigenous context as well.
Thank you so much. It's very interesting explanation. And it also, you actually bring up racism into your comments. I would like to know that today, US is actually having a lot of protests in terms of racism, and also even in the Europe and also across the globe, actually trying to sympathize people with Black Lives Matter. Apart from the political agenda of the liberal left in the US, do you think there is a real racism in the US and in general in the Europe, and how we can actually tackle racial issues and integration?
There is, look, there are elements of racism in the US. There are elements of racism in the UK, but I mean, you would know that there's lots of racism in the European Union countries. Very different, but they also have very different histories. If you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, I think if you look at the people who protested, I think there were more than one element. There were clearly people who wanted to show some solidarity with what had happened in the United States and the murder of Floyd. And clearly that's fine. That's in a free society. We have to, we should allow people to protest and show solidarity. There were people who wanted to point out what they thought was racism in the UK or in Belgium or in France. And I think what they have to do is do more than that and actually point to specific examples. You just can't just say, oh, there's racism. If you want people to do something about it, it's all very well protesting and highlighting it, but you've got to highlight the exact issues. What are the detailed issues that you feel ought to be tackled? And then there was a third element who just wanted to cause trouble. There are always people who will try and hijack these marches or these movements to cause trouble. We have a party in the UK called the Socialist Workers' Party, who always used to turn up to marches and give people banners and try and cause trouble. And sadly, that dilutes the message. There is no doubt is racism, but I think we've got to be quite clear. There's racism everywhere. It's not just white on black. There's my parents are from Guyana, British Guyana, and now Guyana, and my ancestry is from India, as you know. In Guyana, there was racism between the blacks and the Asians. There was black on Asian racism. There was Asian on black racism. People are now talking about Gandhi and what his views about the black people were, for example. So it's not as simple as that. Even in the Britain United Kingdom, there's even racism between the West Indians and the Africans, for example. Now, that doesn't mean we should ignore the bigger pictures, but we have to, I think, be specific about the issues. In the United States, clearly, we are seeing, especially with the age of modern cameras, we are seeing a lot of police brutality, and people want to hold those police to account. The funny thing is, a lot of these organisations have strong labour unions, and it's interesting now that that people are now asking questions about the power of the police unions, for example. In my own country, the United Kingdom, my dad came to Britain in the 50s, worked on the buses, worked on the railways and the buses. It was relatively easy because Britain went to the Commonwealth and asked for people to come to Britain to work. But there were certain sectors, there were very few black firemen. There were very few black policemen. Those labor unions were very racist and protectionist about their sectors. They didn't want black or Asian people in those sectors. So I think there is still racism. I think we have to look at all the different types of racism. But it's very sad the way that people have just toppled these statues without having a debate about it. I think we need a proper discussion. I'm quite torn. I think some of these statues should come down maybe, but let's have a proper discussion, vote, debate about them. But some of them should stay to remind us of the empire and what the British did, good and bad. And let's have a proper discussion about that in a modern context. Not say, let's look at what was good about the empire, what was bad about the empire. And let's look about what was good about these historical figures and bad about them. Now, you may want to move them all off into a theme park, but I don't think giving into mob rule just encourages these people.
Thank you so much, Kamall. It's actually a very interesting one. So my next question is actually kind of a follow.
Can I ask you, how long are you into? I thought we had an hour. How long?
Yes, we are almost. This is the last question.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Okay. How hard is it to actually become a person you are? Because you actually raised as a son of a bus driver, immigrant son of a bus driver, to one of the most powerful voices in European politics. How hard it is to actually reach that level? Because most of the people see is actually what you actually already achieved. I would like to see how hard it was, your journey was, and how you actually achieved that.
No, well, thank you very much. And I'm very happy to answer that question, because one of my personal mottos is to make a difference and inspire others to make a difference. And I'm very happy when I used to hear stories, and when even today younger politicians come up to me and say, thank you for what you did. You showed me that I could go into politics myself, or that Asian people, black people could be in politics in all parties. I was very fortunate with my parents. As I said, my dad came to Britain in the 50s. Faced a lot of racism in Britain in the 50s. My mother came in the 60s, but they always told me that there's no limit to what you can achieve. If you believe in yourself, you believe in God, and you work hard. My father also told me, look, don't believe this stuff about we're all created equal. It's wonderful to hear that we're all created equal, and on one level we are. But we're not all created with equal wealth or equal opportunities. So, excuse me. So he said to me, look, Syed, I want you to work twice as hard as the white kids in school. He said, it's not fair, but stop thinking life is fair and work twice as hard. I think things are better for this generation and there's more equality, but it was still tough as a kid in the 70s in Britain. And also the other thing is there are plenty of people who will tell you how difficult it is, even people in your own communities. So I remember, very much a working class kid, and a lot of my friends growing up go, oh, it's too difficult. These people will never allow us to be successful. Latterly, it's because we're working class, or it's because of our color, or it's because of our religion. This society is not fair. We'll never do that. And my parents used to say to me, first of all, people who say that you can't do something are showing their limitations, not yours. Don't be limited by their limitations, but also be prepared to try and break down barriers. And if you see a wall, don't just hit your head against the wall and go, I can't do anything. Find a way round the wall, over the wall, find a door through the wall, be determined. And sometimes it was tough. I'll be honest, sometimes it was very tough. If anyone tells me, they face no racism or no discrimination, I think great for them. I think most people face some discrimination. But don't forget, there was different types of discrimination. It could be color discrimination, it could be religious discrimination, it could be gender discrimination. Women still find it tougher in many of our societies, even though they've made great strides. it could be class distinction. It could be caste distinction in some examples. There are still barriers, and there are many of us who face barriers. But don't just look at the barriers. Think about how you can overcome those barriers. So generally, I would take the advice my parents gave me. I've been lucky, and I'm not saying that everyone can do this. I remember when James Brown, the American soul singer, started promoting black capitalism, and he said, "Look, if I can do it, so can you." And a lot of people said, "Yeah, but that's all very well, James Brown saying that, but he was talented, he was motivated. Not everyone is like that." And sometimes, so there are people who will not always succeed, but you can all try to succeed. Believe in yourself. If you believe, if you're religious, believe in God, or believe in pray, but also work hard. It's not easy. You have to work hard. My dad told me to work twice as hard as the other kids. Things aren't going to come to you. No one owes you anything, and you can sit back and complain, or you can try and fight, break down those barriers, not only for yourself but for future generations. So I'm hoping by the fact that I did it and I became the leader in the group in Europe, that I showed most of the white people in Europe that, I would stand up there and I would speak. And I knew that there were some racists in the European Parliament who didn't like the fact that there was a dark face speaking in a very English accent. But that gave me far more satisfaction than going on a protest and burning down a building or knocking down a statue. That for me was the best way to break down those barriers and to allow other people, hopefully, to do similarly. And there will be future generations who take it even further.
Thank you so much, Professor Kamall. When I actually gone through your story, it was actually very inspiring. That's why I actually asked this question.
Thank you.
How did you make it that heights? And your commitment, your courage, commitment, and also your hard work actually always inspired many young people, young freedom fighters who's actually striving for classical liberal ideas and free market ideas. So thank you so much for giving a time for us. I know you're a very busy man, but still you actually gave a time to us for 1 hour long. It's very, very huge. And thank you so much. And we would like to work with you in further in the future to advancing these ideas in India and also outside India. Thank you so much, Professor. Have a good day.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. And I hope that we can continue to work together. It's important that we work together as classical liberals across the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir.